Let's talk about authentication in the latest Next.js. This is a complete overview of the things you need to protect, how to protect them, and also very importantly, some best practices. We'll also talk about some really tricky pitfalls that you want to avoid. So it's a complete guide. Make sure you watch it to the end so you really understand authentication in Next.js. So before we start, we need to understand how Next.js works. So if we zoom out a little bit, this entire thing is one Next.js app. So we have some client-side part, which will run in the browser, and we have a server-side part, which runs on a server. Now, typically in terms of protecting things, we are going to prioritize the server side because from here is where we interact with our database. And our data is the most important. We do not want unauthorized people to access our data. And since we are accessing the data from our server side, everything that we do on the server side needs to be secure. And so we need to be really careful with what we do here. People can change things in the browser. That is typically not the end of the world. Now, authentication is also relevant on the client side because maybe we want to show the logged in user's avatar or email address. So we want to display some user information perhaps in the UI. So I'll also talk about how to do that. So I have a very simple Next.js app. Let's say you're building some kind of SaaS or some tool that allows people to keep track of their expenses. So you have like a landing page, which is just a public page. Everybody should be able to see this. But we also have a dashboard which should be protected. Right? So only logged in users should be able to access this and actually submit expenses here that they can keep track of. You can see I'm displaying the user information in the upper left corner here. I can log out if I want. So this app will show you all of the fundamentals of Next.js authentication. So this little app will actually show you how to properly authenticate your Next.js application. So if we actually quickly take a sneak peek at the code, we want to prioritize really the server side because from here is where we access the database. Now, what do you have on the server side in Next.js? We have server components. Let's start there. So a server component can be, for example, the actual page component. So what you see here on the home page, this is typically a server component. If I take a look at the code for this very quickly, you don't have to understand everything, but you can see these days we have React components that run on the server only, and it's just some markup here, and that's basically what you see here. Now, I also have this dashboard page, and this one should be protected. This is also a server component, right? So here, actually, I have an authentication check. And we'll talk about where you want to do this in a server component or in the layout file, which is what a lot of people seem to do. Typically not recommended in my view. We also have something called middleware. We'll talk about that. Right, so you can see here I'm doing an authentication check before I'm accessing my data. Right, so remember when you access your data, you want to make sure that the user is properly authenticated. If they are not authenticated, I'm redirecting them to the login page. So typically you're going to get data from your database in a server component these days. So this type of logic is very common. Now to update data, to add something, to edit something, to delete something, you're typically going to use server action. So if I'm creating another expense here, I'm going to use a server action for this, which will add something to the database. So we need to make sure that we protect server actions as well. They are actually very similar to API endpoints. We'll talk about that. You can see here I'm doing an authentication check before I'm interacting with my database. Route handlers these days are typically used for webhooks. So let's say you're using Stripe for payment. When somebody paid, Stripe will notify you. They will send you a so-called webhook. That's typically the major use case for these traditional API routes. But for your traditional post, put, and delete requests, you'll be using server actions. We'll also talk about roles and permissions. Maybe only paying users should be able to add expenses, not just any logged in user, only users on the pro plan, let's say. Right, so protecting routes is typically done by protecting these page server components. All right, now authentication ultimately comes down to cookies actually. So you can see I'm logged in, which essentially just means I have a valid access token. So typically this is a so-called JWT, JSON Web Token. So you can see under the application tab, I have this access token. As long as I have this, I can show this to the app, which will grant me access to its features and its routes. That's essentially how authentication works, and it's encrypted, so I have to decrypt it to get the actual useful information. And it is sort of encrypted, so I have to decrypt it, you could say, to get the actual useful information out of it, including the user information like avatar and technically I could code that myself as the app developer. I could do authentication myself, do it yourself. As you saw in my code, I'm actually using a third party here. I'm using Kinde. They are sponsoring this video, but I had a great time working with Kinde. I'm a brand ambassador for them. That's also what I would use myself if I was creating some app or software. And I wouldn't do it myself anymore because it's pretty error prone. It takes longer and you don't have all of the features that you get out of the box with a third-party solution. So if you want to check out Kinde, you can find a link in the description, but that's what I will use throughout the video. But all of the concepts that we'll talk about are valid for other solutions that you may be using. So if you really want to do it yourself, well, the logic of the authentication here will not change, right? You still need to protect server components, server actions, etc. So now in terms of the solution that you're using, I do recommend using a third party. And again, I've really enjoyed working with Kinde, so that's what I would use. There's just so many benefits in my view to using a third party because I don't have to worry about all these JSON web tokens. You can see I also have a refresh token here, right? Because this access token will expire at some point and then we have to sort of get a new one with a refresh token. And yes, technically you can do all of that yourself. Yeah, it's just very error prone in my view. Also, I get a slick dashboard here out of the box, where I can manage all of my users, their roles and permissions, the ways that they can authenticate themselves with a phone or email and code, with social connection. And soon they will also make it easier to add billing. So you can connect the billing with the authentication. They will give me a login page. So if I log out here and if I try to sign in here, I get all of this login. I get the entire login flow with the login page out of the box as well. So that's what I would use. And when I'm logged out, by the way, you can see those tokens are gone, right? So logged in just means you have those tokens. I don't have a token anymore. I'm not logged in. So now if I try to go to the dashboard, it will not show that page. It will redirect me to the login page. All right. So I just removed all of the authentication from this app. So right now we just have a very simple homepage with just some markup, and this page should stay public, right? Very standard setup where you have like a public landing page, and then we can go to the /dashboard route here, and we want this to be private, right? Right now it's public because if we go there, you can see there is no authentication check. We are just getting the data from the database, mapping over that here and creating some markup from that. Right? The actual markup here is not important. The important part here is that we don't have any protection right now. Anyone can just go to /dashboard. They could also just type it in and they could start adding expenses here and keeping track of them. But we want to make sure only logged in users have access to this dashboard route and all of this functionality. So we need an authentication solution. And like I said, I'm going to use today's sponsor, Kinde. So here in the dashboard, I can create an application. I have other apps, but this will be for the expenses app. Also expenses app, and Next.js is actually more of a back-end framework. So here we can then click on Next.js. I will quickly go through it here. We already have an existing app here. I just have to set these callback URLs, boom, boom. I have to install the package for Kinde. I will just install the package like this. I need to add some environment variables. All right, so you can see after login, we are redirecting to /dashboard. That's good. And I need to add an API endpoint within my own Next.js app. That is something Kinde will be using. So I can just paste the entire path like this. Then I can copy the content here and paste that here as well. This is something Kinde will use internally. All right, so now Kinde is enabled in our app, but we are not using any of it. So let's start off with the most important part here, which is to protect this route. So how do we protect routes in Next.js? How do we make sure that if I logged in, how do we make sure that if somebody is not authenticated and they try to go, maybe they type it in /dashboard, how do we make sure they cannot access this? So this is actually a page component, and that is actually a server component here in Next.js. So if we go to /dashboard, you can see this is actually a server component. And here we are accessing our data. We want to be very careful with that. So before we do that, we probably want to have an authentication check. So with Kinde, whenever we need some functionality, we can use the get Kinde server session. So anywhere on the server, whether it's server component, server action, a route handler, we can use that. And we can get many things from this actually, even their access token, also the user itself, also the user information, their roles and permissions, the organization. But in this case, we just want to know if they're authenticated or not. Now that is actually a promise, so I have to do this await is authenticated. If the result is negative, we are going to redirect them to this /API. That's actually this route that we set up here. Basically hand it off to Kinde and they will see I'm not logged in and they will serve me a login page. But if I am authenticated, we're gonna continue here. So let's try that out. Let's see if I click on dashboard here, let's see what happens. Okay, and you can see it's loading and indeed I'm redirected to the login page. If I try to type in dashboard in the URL directly like this, you can see I'm also redirected, right? So this is a very simple example of protecting that /dashboard route. So now of course I need to be able to log in, but I don't have any account yet. So here I can say no account, create one. I want to allow my users to log in with, for example, GitHub. So here in the Kinde dashboard, I can go to authentication and here I can also configure the options they have to authenticate themselves. So email and code is pretty standard. I will leave that. Password and email, but I also like to add some social connection for their GitHub account. I will save that. Okay, it's updated. Now if I refresh here, you can see I also have this GitHub account option. I will click on that. All right, and then indeed I am redirected to /dashboard. So now I can access it. If I check out application here, you can see I have my access token. I don't have to create an access token. That's what Kinde is doing for me here. All right, so now the user is logged in, but we're gonna test authentication throughout our app. So we also wanna be able to log out again so we can test whether something is indeed protected. So typically I like to add some kind of logout link so we can easily log out as well. Let's actually put that in a header. So the header here is also a server component. So I can use that same function, get Kinde server session. I can check if there is somebody logged in. And if that's the case, I can use this logout link component I get from Kinde here as well, right? So they provide some default components out of the box. Now we need to include this header somewhere. Now I like to add that header on every page in my app. So I actually want to make it part of my layout here so that for every page, not just /dashboard, but also the homepage, for example, it will always be there, right? So you can imagine the children in the layout are basically the individual page components, right? So this dashboard page will essentially go here. And then when you go to the homepage, it will be the homepage that's here. So the header is always on top of the pages. All right, so if we now check it out, you can see I have a logout link here. If I click on that, I should be redirected to the homepage. And if I then check my cookies, you can see my cookies are cleared here, right? So now if I try to go to the dashboard, you can see I'm not allowed because I'm not logged in. So now I need to actually have a way of logging in, not just by being redirected when I'm trying to access a protected route. I also want to have some buttons here for logging in. So on the homepage, I'm going to add this login link component as well as the register link that I also get from Kinde. Make sure to import it from this path, and then I can click on the button and then it will give me the login page. So here I can then log in if I already have an account or create one. And by the way, then here in your Kinde dashboard, you will see your users information here. So the people that signed up, and then you can manage them here. You can see the profile, activity, suspend, delete, etc. So now we have a very simple example of adding some authentication to our app. We are currently doing the authentication check here in this page component itself. So we are protecting /dashboard like this. Is this the best way of doing it? What if you also want to protect other pages? Say the home page should also be protected. Should we then just copy everything and then sort of paste it here? Do we have to do it for every page like this? It seems like a lot of work to do it this way. And so what some people are inclined to do is they think, oh, I'm going to do it once, not in every individual page. Right? I'm going to remove it from the individual pages and I'm just going to do it once for the entire app in the layout actually, right? So you may be inclined to do this, and this is typically, I would say, not recommended. Let's say I do it like this. Let's say I do it like this. So now I only have to check in the layout. So now whenever I go to my app, everything is protected, you would say, right? So I will immediately get this, and so I can log in. Let's log in here. So that seems to work as before. And so you may think, okay, so now we've protected the entire app properly. Now this is typically not recommended because this layout component, this is also a component, it will not re-render when you navigate in your app. So if I go to the homepage here, and if I just add a console log here so we can see when it's rendering, rendering just means it's going to run all the statements inside the React component. That's what it means to render a React component. So we only do the authentication check when this component is actually running. You can see when I load the app, you will see that it's rendering. Actually, maybe, right? So on the initial load, it seems to be working. The thing is, when you then, after the initial load, when you are then navigating to another route, for example, now I load the app and now I'm going to navigate to /dashboard, you can see it's not re-rendering anymore. And if I click on dashboard again, you can see this root layout does not re-render. So practically this means after the app is loaded and the user navigates to another route, you are not doing the authentication check. That is typically not recommended. So typically, we actually do want to have the authentication check when the user navigates. So in that case, it is better to keep it in the page component and yes, perhaps just duplicate it for the other pages. The other option you have is actually middleware. So right now we are protecting directly in the server component. So when there is an incoming request into our server side for a component like that, we're doing an authentication check. But you can also do it in middleware. Middleware is actually also part of the server side, so I should probably move it over a little bit here. So when there is an incoming request, we can make it go through middleware first, and middleware will decide if the request should go through or the user is not authenticated and we're going to redirect them. So instead of doing it in the page component, we may actually also create middleware here in Next.js. I will do it as a direct child of the source folder here. And then in here, I have to export a function. So it will get that incoming request, and then we can decide what to do with that request, whether to redirect or let it continue. That's what Kinde will check for me. They have a with auth function. So I just pass along that request to Kinde, and Kinde will make sure it's handled properly. And then here we can decide on which routes we want that middleware to run. So in this case, we would want to protect the /dashboard route. So I would say the requests to /dashboard should go through the middleware. The home page can stay public. So now I can remove the authentication check from the individual page. Now it's only the middleware that will check for the authentication status. So let me log out here. All right, so now if I try to go to /dashboard, let's see what happens. And you can see it's already loading. It's going to load the login page. So those are the two main options you have to protect routes. You can do it in each page component individually, or you can decide to use middleware. I tend to prefer middleware. It's a cleaner overview because you have all of the routes here for the matcher. So here you have all the routes that should be private. Whereas if you do it in the page component here, it's kind of messy. You have to duplicate things. You don't have a clean overview of did you properly protect each page that should be private. This is a better overview. But also in this middleware, you typically have some other redirect rules as well, maybe for internationalization, for example, maybe A/B testing. So there's a bunch of redirect rules already typically in the middleware. And with authentication, and authentication is also sort of redirecting, right? If the user is not logged in, we're going to redirect them to the login route. If you do it in middleware, you have all that redirect logic in one place. So I think it's just better for organization overall. And one big benefit of middleware is, especially if you have a content website, like an article website, and the articles are behind a login, we want to keep those pages statically rendered, as it's called. We'll talk more about this. If you do it in middleware, the protected pages can stay static. That's going to be faster. Whereas if you do the authentication check in the page component directly like this, they will be dynamically rendered. So whenever there's an incoming request, you have to run the entire logic here again to generate the output. With middleware, you can keep it statically rendered. The HTML can just be created once during the build and be served over and over again. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. So I would say middleware has more advantages than doing the authentication check in the page, but it's pretty close. Sometimes middleware may not be possible, right? You may be using an ORM or some other solution that may not work in middleware, because middleware, as of recording, is typically deployed to edge functions. Those are running in a more limited runtime. And so you may not be able to use an ORM, for example, or there may be other issues with that. So it may simply not be feasible to do it in middleware. In that case, you kind of have to do it in the page component. Right? So I would typically prefer middleware unless it's not possible. In that case, I would stick to using the page component check. Right, so let me actually remove it here. And for now, I will just continue by using the middleware option like this. All right, I will quickly log in again, and now I'm logged in again. So that's how we can protect routes. Now let's talk a little bit about protecting server actions. These are actually a major part of a lot of your Next.js app, because this is how you're going to update data. In this app, we are doing that when a user submits an expense. So on this dashboard page, we have this form. So if the user fills out an amount and a description, they can click on add expense, and this will submit the form. So the way it works is I can use the action attribute here with a so-called server action. Those are functions defined, for example, in a file with use server at the top. This means it's going to be a function that runs only on the server, and we can use it as part of the action attribute here, which will make Next.js collect all the data from the form when I submit it and send it to my server side here, where I get the data right here. You get it in a form data structure, as it's called. It's a bit tricky to work with, but basically you can just get the description and amount with a getter like this, and then I can actually add that to my database. So here I'm interacting with my database again, and what you can do then immediately in Next.js as well is you can call revalidate path. So without this, if I comment this out, if I would add something here and I would say test, if I now submit this, you can see it's submitted, but it's not immediately updated here in the UI. I have to refresh to see the update. If I add this back, now if I submit this, you can see I don't have to refresh, it's actually added here. So it will actually trigger this dashboard page to render again. And so it will get the latest expenses from the database right after we just added one. That's why it's updated. Now, the important part about server actions is that there is still a fetch call. I'm not doing it myself, but you can see when I click here, there is still this fetch call that Next.js is doing for me. And you can see these server actions are actually post requests to the URL on which you're using them. So in this case, it's on /dashboard. So essentially, A server action is like a post API endpoint on your server at the location, the URL on which you're using it. That means technically somebody could try to make a post call to this URL and they may be able to trigger this function to run. So if we want to only allow logged in users to add expenses, we also need to authenticate this, and we need to be careful here. That also means, by the way, that the input here, we're just assuming right now it's going to be the form data from that form, but somebody could technically just trigger this with any kind of data. So a more precise type, a more safer type in my view would be to use unknown and then use something like Auth to properly validate the incoming data. I have other videos on that, but we also have to think about authentication. Now remember, the server action lives on the URL that you're using at /dashboard, and we seem to be protecting that here in middleware as well, right? So here we are indeed running this authentication check on /dashboard. So you may think that this is enough. What if I use this server action on the homepage or some other URL, right? Or somebody on a team could also invoke this server action, maybe on a different form on some other route, right? Maybe somebody adds this form to our homepage, right? Just to show you. Now, if I submit this, you can see we have a fetch call, but now it's on the home route, and that route is meant to be public. So we are not, and that is not being protected here. So whether you do the authentication check in the page component or in middleware, I would say that is not enough. That's basically your first line of defense. But you want to do an additional check at the location where you're actually interacting with the database. Right? So before we do anything here, we also want to have an authentication check. So if you also do it in here, it doesn't matter where you invoke the server action on which route, because you're always going to run this first before you get down here. So this is a better practice in my view. You want to have an authentication check as close as possible to where you're actually interacting with your database. So this makes it more robust in my view. So let me actually remove it from the homepage again. This was just an example, but you can imagine that this is quite error prone, right? You can reuse components. You can reuse the form component on some other route. That's possible. So those were server actions. And what about these route handlers? We're not using them as much anymore. For the traditional post, put, and delete requests, you are mostly using server actions, but maybe in some scenario, you're still using the route, you're using route handlers to do something like that. And it's the same story, right? We can do an authentication check right there before we interact with our database. So that was server-side protection. What about the client side? Because sometimes we want to show some user information like their avatar, their email. That's also closely related to their authentication status. So what if we want to show their avatar and their email in the top left corner of this header, for example? This is actually really tricky. A lot of people make a mistake here. Let's see what we can do here. So let's go to that header component, which remember is included on every page because we added it here to the layout. So all the pages here, basically the children here, will always have that header on top, which is our intention here. That's fine. So I will replace this div here with what we actually want to show here. We're going to get the user information that will actually have some loading status. So how do we get user information? Well, with Kind, they also give us this get user function. So I can actually just get the user like this. So I'm replacing it with what we actually want here, which is we want to have an image of the user with their picture and their email. And if there is no user, we will just display not logged in. Now, how do we get this user? With Kind on the server side, we just need this one function. It will also give us this get user function. So if we want to have user information, for example, we can call that. This will give us the user information, like their avatar. Now, if I save here, and now if I go back, you can see I have my profile image here as well as the email with which I'm logged in. So is this the recommended way of doing it? And actually, no. This is actually really tricky, but especially with app-wide components like a header, you want to be extra careful because what you're doing here, whatever authentication solution you may be using, they're all doing the same thing, which is under the hood, they are checking for the header. When you invoke any of these two functions in a server component like this on a page, Next.js will make that page dynamically rendered, right? So Kind under the hood is using either cookies or headers, and not just Kind, any authentication solution is using that. They have to, because to check whether the user is authenticated, they need to see if we have that token in our cookies. They need to see if you actually have an access token in your cookies, right? So they're going to check the cookies, one of these functions or both, and therefore, and what Next.js will do is they will make the page on which you're using that dynamically rendered. And remember, we are using this header. So let me prove that to you. If I now run a build, it will show that all the routes now are dynamic. So here it says generating static pages, but there are none, as you'll see. All right, so here you'll see, so at the end of the build, it will show you which routes are static and which routes are dynamically rendered. So if we can, we want a route to be statically rendered, because that means that during the build, for example, for the homepage, we can already generate HTML out of this during the build. And then whenever somebody is coming to the homepage, we can just immediately serve the HTML. Nothing has to be rendered. It's statically rendered once during the build and then served over and over again. This is faster, and that is the default. So if we can, we want to keep it that way. However, if you're using cookies or headers in some page, Next.js will turn that page into a dynamically rendered page. And we are using that here. Although we are not technically using it ourselves, our authentication provider is using that under the hood, and they have to do that. Any authentication solution that's reading cookies or headers will do that. And that's fine typically, but if you do that in an app-wide component like the header, which we are including on every page, right? The header is sitting on every page, right? On the home page. That means that now all the pages will be, you can see it with the symbol here. So now whenever somebody is coming to the page, the app will render the whole page again. Right, so all of that logic that you may have on that page will have to run again for each new request coming to the home page, right, which will take longer and is less efficient. A page like that really should be static if we can keep it like in most cases. So how can we still have a header and display user information like this, but keep the pages static? By turning it into a client component actually. So what we can do, because then we will not use the cookies or headers function. So if we make it as a client component, now we cannot use this async anymore. And now we need to use a different hook from Kind. It's called use Kind browser client. I can use this anywhere on the client, just like I could use the other one. Just like I could use the other function just on the server, but this one is for the client and it's very similar. I actually can remove the await here, and here it's actually a boolean. So I can even simplify this by just removing this and replace it with this. If we go back and let's see if it still works, if I refresh. All right, so now if I go back, let's actually try logging in again and seeing what happened. Now you can see I still have my user information here, so it's still displaying this on every page, but let's see if the home page now is still statically rendered. And by the way, in the latest Next.js, you will also have this indicator that will show you if it's still static or not. And actually it seems a little bit buggy to me. So I still run a build if I want to know for sure if a route is statically or dynamically rendered. So let's just run another build here and see what we get. All right, so it's gonna generate static pages here. Let's see what we get. All right, so now we have another result. Now you can see that the home page with this symbol is statically rendered. Generate the HTML once during the build and then serve it over and over again. But still, we have user information that we are displaying here. It's just that it will be a client component. So there will be an extra network round trip to make that work. That's okay. That's not a problem usually. So this is a better way of accessing user information in app-wide components especially, right? So a bit tricky, it's a bit of a pitfall actually, but now at least you've seen it. All right, so very quickly, some other things as well. Here we have a user submitting expenses, but we could have other users as well. So typically when we store the expenses in our database, we want to keep track of which user has submitted these expenses, of course. Now, if you're doing authentication yourself, you would have in your model or schema for your database, you would have some relationship like this. In line with my preference, I'm using a third party. So how do I sort of connect that data that third party has on my users with my own data in my own database? So what I could do is, well, Kind will still give me a user ID. I can still add the user ID whenever I create an expense in my database. So then if we go to my server action where I'm inserting a new expense in the database, I can make sure that I'm also including the user ID, right? So here again, I can use get user and we can just get the user information on the server side like this. And then here, when we create a new expense in the database, when the user submit, we can just store user ID and I can just use that ID I get from Kind. So I had to update the schema of my database. So here during development, it will lose my data, but I can just try adding a new expense here. Okay, let's quickly inspect the data here. I can do that with Prisma Studio, just so I can see what's in my database. So now you can see I have one expense in my database and it has a user ID now, and you can see this is some string that I got from Kind, right? So that's an easy way of sort of connecting that external data from your auth provider with your own data. And then here, when we load the expenses from the database, we want to load it specifically for that particular user, right? So then here, I want to get the user information, so I can use the same function here. And then for find many, I have to do some filter here where the user ID is just that particular user's ID. So then when I load the page, it should only load the expenses for that particular user. So I'd say this is a simple way of sort of connecting the data from your external auth provider with your own data, your own database. Of course, I can also export the data from Kinde manually if I want. Last thing I want to talk about is authorization. This has to do with roles and permissions, but also even before we get there, there's a pitfall or sort of something that people forget, especially junior developers. So here we have a way to add an expense. You can imagine that we also have a way to edit an expense and delete an expense. We can create a function which will look very similar, right? All the logic for editing is very similar to adding an expense. So I'm just going to duplicate it and call it edit expense. We would still get some form data, but maybe we need to get the ID of the expense that needs to be edited, right? So maybe you're passing along the ID. Only logged in users should be able to do this. So we still have authentication check. We're still getting data here. We still want to get the user. Now we don't want to add it. We want to edit it. So here we would say update. And which one do we want to update? Well, where the ID of the expense is whatever was passed into the function here. We don't need to update the user ID here. That's only necessary when we create it. So maybe we're just changing the description or the amount. Now you may think, okay, so we have the auth check here. So this is now properly protected, right? This edit function. I see this all the time with editing and also deleting. This is actually not enough, right? Because what are we checking here with the auth check? We are just checking if the user has a valid token basically in their cookie. Like this user is basically making a request and we know after this, okay, so this is indeed bytegrad@gmail.com. So we know who the user is, but what if they pass along some ID of an expense that doesn't belong to them, right? I could invoke this function and I'm logged in, but I'm passing along an ID perhaps that's belonging to somebody else, to John@gmail.com. Right, so here, before we edit that particular ID, that particular expense in the database with some new description and new amount, we also need to have authorization check, right? A lot of people forget about this actually. So this is the authentication check and you're using your auth provider here, right? So we may want to check if the user that's trying to edit this is actually the creator of this expense. So I need to get the expense from my database and I need to get the user ID. And then I can check if the user ID on that expense is actually equal to the user that is logged in, right? The authentication check is basically just checking, does this user actually have a valid access token? Right? It does not check whether the expense that's being edited belongs to that user, right? It will look something like this. This is especially relevant for editing and deleting. And a lot of people simply forget about this because they think this check is enough. Now, it could also be something different. Maybe only admin users can edit expenses. That's also an authorization check. So it should actually be an admin, right? So now check if user is admin. Now the check looks a little bit different. Now we don't have to get the expense from the database. Now we just have to check whether this user has an admin role perhaps or has some certain permissions. And that's also why I like using Kinde, because they make it very easy to work with roles and permissions. I can manage it right here from my dashboard. So with permissions, I get fine-grained control over what users are allowed to do. So we could have a permission, for example, edit an expense. It allows user to edit expenses. Okay, I can add this permission and we could have another one, perhaps deleting expenses. Delete expense, maybe also viewing an expense in the first place, view expense, right? So basically this is the most fine-grained control I get over what users are allowed to do. And then you group it together in roles. So a basic user only gets view expenses, but an admin user gets all of the permissions, right? So here with roles, I can say a basic user. New members should automatically become basic users. And then here I can assign the permissions for that role, right? So new users should only be able to view expenses, let's say. So I'm going to save here and then I'm going to create an admin role. So admin user, admin user, admin user. Make sure, right? So here, of course, I don't want to assign it to all new members. So I don't want to do that. Now an admin user should be able to do everything, right? So they get all the permissions. So now I've set it up in my Kinde dashboard. Okay, now I do need to go to the tokens here for my app, because that access token, I need to add other things to there if I want to access, for example, the roles. So I want to include the roles in that token. And actually here I can add other things as well, like the organization that the user is part of, some other properties here as well. So I will add that. So now when a new access token is created, when I log in, and let me actually add some roles to that particular user. So this user was already created, but now I can assign basic user or admin. Let's say this is an admin user. I can save here. Okay. So now next time I log in, let's log in. A new access token is created with the roles part of that access token. So then we can access it in our code as well. Now I'm logged in. And actually let's add it to the adding expense to keep it a bit easy. Authorization check if the user is admin. So here what I can use is get role. So before we add something to our database, we're going to check if the user has a role of admin. And actually roles will be an array with all the roles that the user has, but in our app, we're only going to have one. So I'm just going to take the first role and we'll check if its key is admin-user. That's the name of the key I gave it in the kind dashboard. I'm logging all the roles. So let's see what we will. All right, so now I'm going to submit this one more time and let's see what we get. All right, so that succeeded. And you can see here, it logged the roles of the user. And indeed, we can see the user is an admin user. Right, so very slick way of adding roles and permissions, I have to say, here with Kind. Last thing I want to mention is a so-called data access layer, or DAL. This is basically a different way of structuring our code to access our data. So what we are doing now, we're essentially interacting with our database all over the place. So here in this dashboard page, I'm making a query to my database. Then here in a server action, making a request to my database. Now, what is the problem with this? Well, we actually already saw it with the server action case, which is that if we only protect the dashboard route, which is currently what we're doing, right, middleware, we're only checking the dashboard route, right? We're only protecting the dashboard route. If we accidentally use that server action on the home page, it would not be protected by just this. The same is true if you're fetching data in a React component. Okay, so right now we are fetching data here, dashboard page. Okay, now you could say this is protected right now. Okay, what if you accidentally perform this request to your server on the home page? And maybe not you, maybe somebody else on your team decides to make this query here on the home page. Well, how likely is this? Well, remember, we can not only fetch here in the page, maybe we have some other component. Maybe we have an expenses list component, and in there we are fetching. And somebody could reuse that component on the homepage or some unprotected route. When you're interacting with your database all over the place, it's possible that somebody at some point will access data on a public route. Even though, of course, we don't want to do this on a public route. We don't want to show all the expenses from our database on a public route. So there is some risk here So as a best practice, what you could do is create a dedicated place where you access all of your data. You can call that data access layer. And here you could create one for each table in your database. So we have the expense table. And in this file is where I have all the functions where I access my database. So here I have one for get expenses, but we also have one for adding an expense, for editing and deleting. And importantly, here is where we have an authentication check included in all of them. The benefit of this structure is no matter where you use it in your app, in any server component, server action, or route handler, whether it's protected by middleware or not, you always have the authentication check included. So this, in my view, is a best practice. I have other videos on this. And this is also what the Next.js team recommends for new projects, where the data access layers. I have another video on this with Kind as well, so check that video out as well. In any case, I want to thank Kind for sponsoring this video. Make sure you check them out. You can find a link in the description. I want to thank you for watching as well. Have a nice day, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.